the German command significantly strengthened its aviation on the Soviet-German front. Due to the formation of new divisions and the use of its allies' units, the main forces of the German aviation were concentrated here. For the offensive in the Stalingrad direction, the German command concentrated about 1,200 aircraft. The circumstances for the back of the Soviet 8th Air Army were challenging. Aviation units were stationed at airfields on the right bank of the Don, very near to the enemy. Because aviation units were pulled back to the Stalingrad area, an order was given on July 14 to move 4 aviation bases to the left bank of the Don. The German aviation inflicted heavy losses on the retreating parts of the Soviet aerial rear. The crossings over the Don were destroyed. The supplies from the right bank of the Don were not completely transported, and some were destroyed. Thus, by the beginning of the battles on the far approaches to Stalingrad, the Soviet aviation faced difficult conditions. On July 27, the Stukas began bombing the Kala crossing, conducting 6 air raids in one day. The first raid started at 7:15, and the last one at 18:29. A total of about 500 high-explosive and fragmentation bombs were dropped, severely damaging the columns of Soviet troops crossing the river. In the morning of July 17, 1942, hostilities of the aviation began in the large bend of the Don. The main efforts of the 8th Air Army, in the first 6 days of fighting, were aimed at destroying the enemy's strike groups. Substantial support to the ground troops was provided by long-range aviation, which struck at the areas of concentration of German troops in crossings over the Don and Chur rivers for 6 nights. During the ongoing fighting, the composition of the 8th Air Army was reinforced with units and formations from the reserve of the Supreme High Command, which allowed for an increase in the intensity of air operations. As the intensity and effectiveness of Soviet aviation actions increased, the enemy strengthened the protection of their ground forces and began to strike at our airfields. However, the Germans were unable to reduce the activity of the Soviet aviation. The destruction of Luftwaffe aircraft was mainly carried out through effective strikes on airfields. To support bombers and attack aircraft, groups of fighters were sent to their operational areas to clear the airspace. Despite the dominance of German aviation in the air, our pilots engaged in battle, inflicting losses on them. At the beginning of the fighting on the approaches to Stalingrad, German strike groups were supported by up to 1,000 aircraft and maintained air supremacy. Given the complexity of the situation, the High Command directed the relocation of 5 long-range aviation divisions from the Moscow air hub closer to the combat zone, which allowed for increased strikes against the enemy. On August 23, German aviation, taking advantage of its superiority in forces, relocated to forward airfields and delivered a massive strike on Stalingrad, involving several hundred aircraft. Throughout the day, it made about 2,000 combat sorties. Fires broke out in the city. This was a barbaric destruction of a city with a population of thousands of civilians. The Soviet command carried out measures to strengthen defenses and counter the enemy. The 8th and 16th Air Armies were replenished with new aircraft and personnel. The interaction between aviation and troops, and among different branches of aviation, improved. The efforts of the aviation were focused on supporting and covering the troops during the defense of the city. The air defense of airfields, the deployment, and the supply of aviation were enhanced. Rear units created the necessary conditions for ensuring the combat operations of the air regiments. 3 engineering aviation battalions and 8 airfield service battalions were transferred to construct 50 new airfields beyond the Volga, and 3,500 local residents were mobilized. As a result of the activities carried out, logistical support for the aviation combat operations was carried out mainly without interruption. The engineering and technical staff of the aviation regiments, at the initiative of the attack pilots of the 16th Air Army, retrofitted the cockpits of the IL-2 aircraft for aerial gunners and installed machine guns on them. The staffing schedule did not provide for aerial gunners for these aircraft, so initially, mechanics, technicians, and specialists in aviation armament and special equipment flew on combat missions. At the beginning of November, the industry began supplying the front with the 2-seater IL-2, which contributed to improving the actions of the attackers and reducing their losses. The Soviet command took a number of measures to decisively counter the German aviation and improve the situation in favor of our aviation. A radio guidance network was organized. The guidance radio stations transmitted information to pilots in the air about the aerial situation, guided them to the appeared enemy aircraft, called fighters from airfields and redirected them to other targets. In the summer of 1942, the formation of Aviation Reserve Corps of the High Command began, consisting of 2 to 4 aviation divisions. The composition of fighter regiments was increased from 22 to 32 combat aircraft. The aviation regiments were replenished with new types of aircraft and flight personnel. During 27 days of intense fighting on the approaches to Stalingrad, the Red Army Aviation conducted about 16,000 sorties, inflicting heavy losses on German troops and equipment. During this time, the proportion of aviation actions at night nearly doubled. During the battles in Stalingrad, the Soviet aviation operated in close cooperation with the ground forces and gained valuable experience in destroying enemy troops in a large city. The main targets of their actions were individual buildings occupied by the Germans, artillery, mortars, tanks, concentrations of troops, and equipment. Alongside supporting the ground forces, the frontline bomber, assault aviation, and long-range aviation periodically engaged in combat against rail transport and enemy aviation at airfields. Fighter aviation, receiving reinforcements, became more actively engaged in offensive battles. During the 67 days of the defense of Stalingrad, the aviation of the Red Army made 45,325 sorties, dropped 15,440 tons of bombs, and conducted more than 1,000 aerial battles. In aerial battles, at airfields, and through anti-aircraft fire, about 929 enemy aircraft were destroyed. This created favorable conditions for the Red Army to launch a decisive counteroffensive. Aerial reconnaissance promptly identified the areas of concentration of reserves and strike groups of German troops and aviation, providing significant assistance to the General and Air Command. Visual observation of enemy actions was complemented by aerial photography, and the transmission of information about the enemy was carried out via radio from the reconnaissance aircraft.